Welcome to excuse me. Welcome to February's edition of Layer 7 Office Hours. We are wrapping up our discussion on optimizing and best practices around containers today with our star of the show, Gary. And next month we're gonna give Gary a break and explore some other best practices. We'll roll that out on communities and let you know what it's going to be about. But with that, let me turn it over to Gary.
Thanks, Bill. Let me just quickly share my screen. Yeah, so it's good that I have the disclaimer here today. So I'm going to be talking today about some things that aren't currently generally available, but they do represent, I guess, future best practices and so on. So I'll be talking about a couple of experimental components or things that are experimental. That may be subject to change in the future as they're under active development, and a couple of things that aren't currently released but are currently a work in progress. So this is session 4 of 0 to Cloud Hero. If I had to summarize the first 3 sessions as kind of a recap, it would be looking at deploying the container gateway into, in the first session, Kubernetes and Docker, and then to Kubernetes for sessions 2 and 3 using the gateway Helm chart. So the focus has been around getting the gateway up and running, and for the last session, we went into some more advanced use cases for deploying the gateway using the gateway Helm chart. So we used init containers. I think we set up auto scaling. And there's a couple of other things that we also added to that. So we got a bit more advanced with the deployment side of things. We didn't cover in much detail how to administer a gateway once that's up and running. And the main reason for that is for the majority of customers, you already have a process in place to administer gateways. And if you're going with an external MySQL-backed gateway in Kubernetes, then you're going to have much the same experience between appliance or on-prem as you would do in the container world. Sorry, I think there's someone. I can hear some background audio. Okay, so I'm just going to continue. All right, so today we're going to cover Graphman, CI/CD, and the Layer7 operator. So we've just gone through that recap of the previous sessions. So Graphman is currently in an experimental state. Many of you on the call would have already gone through kind of an introduction to Graphman. I'm not going to be covering these topics exhaustively. It's going to be fairly high level. Given the time that we have for this, but in the future we're going to have more instructive breakdowns of how to do what I'm describing today, along with guides to follow along with, and so on in the future. So as always with these sessions, this is meant to be interactive. So if you have questions, feel free to interject throughout, and I'll try and answer them during the session, or I might move them to sort of answer them when if there's a session that sort of comes up and covers it. So I'll start with a very quick Graphman overview. I'll then introduce the concept of config as code and how that works with Graphman and how it'll work with a gateway in the future. The repository structure that we'll get with Graphman and config as code. So the repository being a source of truth for gateways. We'll then take a look at policy as code, which is so I'll go into a bit of context as to what that is, where we currently are with that and Graphman, and where we're looking at getting to in the future with that. We'll then take a look at some of the Graphman tooling. So there is a Node.js client as well as a Postman collection that you can use. We'll be focusing on the Postman collection today. What I wanted to do was finish off at a point where we start with the gateway that we deployed in the previous office hours, also a very similar gateway that we deployed in the previous office hours, and we can use Postman to update that and get all of the latest and greatest onto it. We'll then do an introduction to the Layer 7 operator. So the reason that I'm introducing so I've introduced the Layer 7 operator before, and I think I've introduced the concept of operators before as well in previous office hours. We have some new concepts that we're bringing in with the Layer 7 operator. So all of this is going to work really well from a Grafman perspective. So using Postman or using the Node.js client or using a script and so on. It's not going to work so well if you have ephemeral gateways. So if you don't have an external MySQL database, then you're not going to be able to interface with each of your gateways directly because you don't have the concept. You don't have the concept of clustering without that external MySQL database. So if you update one gateway, it's not going to cascade to all gateways in a cluster. So we found a solution for that with the Layer 7 operator. So I can kind of introduce the concept of that and how we're going to sort of take that forward. And that's going to play into the CI/CD with the Layer 7 operator. So we'll go into a demonstration with that. We'll actually deploy the Layer 7 operator in its current state, and we'll deploy a gateway resource, which is going to be the custom resource that the operator manages for gateway. And we'll also deploy something new that we've created, which is a repository custom resource, which is going to be a connection to that single source of truth that Grafman is going to provide for us. So very, very simple overview of Grafman. So Grafman is a GraphQL API for managing gateway configuration. You can think of it as a modern version or a modern alternative to something like RESTman. So RESTman is not going to be going away anytime soon, but GraphQL is going to make configuration much, much easier than you would have been used to previously with RESTman, the GMU, or a combination of the two. So with GraphQL, all of the responses are going to be in JSON, and that makes configuration as code much easier. So we can take that JSON, we can turn it into file folder structures, as we'll see, and it also means that it's going to be a lot more human readable. And so if you're doing a diff between two different files, it's going to be a lot easier to figure out exactly what's changed between them, between different commits or different pull requests that come through. So the current status is of Grafman. It's an experimental branch of the experimental phase that we have. So you can request access to it. I think many of you on the call already have access to it. You may have played around with it a bit yourselves. So you can request access to that. We've also got the client tooling. So as I mentioned, we've got a Postman collection. There's also a Node.js client. Both of them are the Node.js client is fairly feature rich. The Postman collection doesn't have as much as the Node.js client does. But for the purposes of today, it's going to give us a pretty good idea of what we're going to get and how we can apply that. Things that are up and coming is going to be moving this to a limited availability status, which is going to be kind of more available, and also looking at adding in the ability to bootstrap Grafman JSON bundles to the container gateway or to the gateway as we currently can do with RESTman bundles. So that feature, so that functionality is not currently available, and we're looking to add that in. So on the right here, I've got an image of a Grafman bundle in JSON format. So you can see each entity has an array of items in it. So we've got things like policy fragments. That's going to be an array of policy fragments. Similarly for web API services, cluster properties, scheduled tasks, and so on and so forth. So that's going to be the response that we get for a Grafman query. And we can go through and we can pretty much do whatever we want with this query. So in the example today, we're going to be going through querying everything. So we're going to get everything from a source gateway, and we're going to apply it to a gateway that's never had anything applied to it before, apart from a Hello World service, which is the bundle that we bootstrapped to the gateway in our previous office hours. Yeah, but we can target a specific folder, we can target specific entities, and we can also target specific dependencies with those entities. And that query is going to be responsible for everything that's defined in this file here. As mentioned, the Grafman bundles come in JSON format, and we use that JSON format and the structure with the Node.js tooling to create a really nice file folder structure that makes it really easy to take a look at the different entities that you might have in a gateway in a very human readable way. So this is the file folder structure that we have. So this is created by the Node.js tooling, and the GraphMan client, Node.js client. And so what we have here is each entity gets its own folder, and within those folders, each item has its own JSON file. So from a cluster-wide property perspective, so we'll look at some of those later on. We can change a single cluster-wide property, and we can be sort of sure that we're only changing one thing in one place, and so on. The tooling is then going to take that, turn it back into a single JSON file, and allow you to send that back to the GraphMan API. And obviously, you're also going to be able to do manipulation of that bundle. So if there's specific things that you want to publish, without sort of pushing everything, those are the different things that you can do with the tooling as well. So it's going to be fairly flexible in terms of what you can actually push between gateways. But the overall file folder structure is this, and it's going to be easy to read and easy to sort of understand. So in terms of configuration kind of covers everything on an API. So it kind of covers everything from cluster-wide properties to the way that to the metadata of policies and services themselves. What it doesn't necessarily cover, though, is the actual XML or the actual policy logic that goes into policies, included fragments, and so on. So currently, there's a policy.xml field, which includes everything that's in that policy. And this part here is not something that's human readable. So if you had to go in and change this, you could, but it's going to be a fairly complicated process of trying to find exactly what you need to change within policy. Now, the way that we would advise currently, currently using this is by setting environment variables and then using those environment variables to target backends, with the idea that once you've got your policy logic in place, you don't necessarily need to change logic between environments. You're just changing things like the backend service that you're routing to, a set of credentials that you're using to access a database, and so on. But we are looking at this as something that we need to change and something that we can improve on in the future, or at least give more options. And that's where this is introduced. So this is kind of one of the concepts that we have for policy as code in the future. So instead of having all of that XML that's included policy.xml, you have policy.composed, which has a set of variables and then a set of keywords. Now, these keywords correspond, so much like in the portal where you have policy fragments and policy templates. These would correspond to specific functions, to specific templates, and the tooling would pick up that, hey, you specified that you want to do a pre-route that corresponds to a template, and the tooling would pick that up and build the corresponding XML during the creation. So that'll be done. So that would be done on the client before that's sent into the gateway. So before I head into kind of demoing some of the basics of this in Postman, are there any questions?
When you say human readable, I guess it's better that it's machine readable as well.
Well, I guess
it makes sense to be JSON to be machine readable as well, so you haven't got lots of timestamps and things like that in it.
Yeah, definitely. I'd say as well. So if you're looking at something like RESTman, right? So RESTman is RESTman being XML. There's not a lot of tool sets that work really well with XML in a sort of cross compatible way. Whereas when you look at JSON, there's a lot of different languages that support JSON. So if there was an extension that you wanted to write, or if you wanted to do something very specific that you couldn't do as part of our tooling, then having a script, it could be Python, it could be a very small Go program, it could be JavaScript. You can take that JSON file and you can work with it very easily, as opposed to XML, which is a lot harder to get right, especially with the old mapping system in RESTman. So this is sort of more human readable, easier to work with, and easier to manipulate.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so before I did this, I just wanted to quickly show you the file folder structure of the Grafman client. So for the Grafman client, with access to the experimental feature, what you'll get is an AAR, which is a modular assertion for Grafman. You'll need to include that into your container gateway or into your appliance gateway. You also get this. So this is the Grafman client. And what you can see for the most part here is the Node.js client. So there's a Grafman script that runs a Grafman.js that lives in here, and that gives you a bunch of different options and a bunch of different things that you can do with the Node.js client. So at the moment, it is fairly feature rich. There is a fair amount that you can do. There are some examples given here as to additional things that you can do there as well. And we're also looking at a video series. I think there's a couple of videos already, either on API Academy or on YouTube, of going through the basics of getting started with this. So documentation is very important, and getting as many use cases out as we can is really important as well. So if you have feedback on some of the things that are in this, as you go through them, or things that you aren't quite sure on, then always reach out to us, and we can look to put a video together for that, or just go through that with you in a bit more detail. So we'll be focusing for today on the Postman collection, just sort of conscious of time. So the Postman collection is also fairly feature rich. If you're looking at getting started, you're not necessarily that familiar with GraphQL, as I imagine. So I was definitely a few months ago, or so last year sometime. So the Postman collection is a great way to get started, to take a look at some of the queries that are going to be generated. They're going to be generated for the gateway, and also taking a look at the difference between queries and mutations and so on. So if you go to Postman, the first thing that we'll want to do is go to our source gateway. So our source gateway is configured in the Grafman collection. So you can see I've got a source gateway there, and I've got a target gateway configured. And I can go to my source gateway, and I can just say create bundle. Now, what this is everything from that source gateway. And, so I guess if you're looking at RESTman versus Grafman, one of the reasons that you might look at, moving towards something like Grafman is the time. So that took half a second to grab everything from my source gateway, versus if you had to run the same query in something like RESTman, the amount of time it takes to generate all of the XML and so on, you're looking at several seconds for that response to come back. And equally, when you're applying it, it's going to be a lot faster as well. So if we go so we now have a source bundle, and much like the screenshot, we can see we've got a single JSON file that has everything that gateway contains. Now, the Node.js tooling would turn this configuration into a file folder structure. We'll see that later on when we go through the repository that we'll be using with the Layer7 operator. We have a similar file folder structure, so we can go through the different entities that are included there, and we'll also change one of them and see that being updated in real time. So if I quickly sign into the it'll be that one. If I quickly sign into the gateway, that we're going to be updating. We can take a look and see that we don't actually have anything, or we shouldn't have anything on there at the moment. So this gateway kind of represents what we had at the end of the office hours. So at the end of the last office hours, so we have the Gateway GraphQL management service bootstrapped. So that modular assertion bootstrapped. That's bootstrapped with an init container, and we've also got a very simple hello world service, and we tested that at the end of the previous session. So we don't have anything there, and we now want to apply everything from our source gateway to our target. So all I've got to do is go to the apply and send. That's going to go to the target. And everything is now being applied. So with the response, I get back a summary of all of the things that have been changed. So those are some IDs of cluster properties, IDs of trusted certs, and so on. So I can take this and I can store it. And I've got a summary that I might add to source control, or maybe there's an audit. Maybe there's an audit requirement. So I may save that to an audit log, or sort of whichever process. If I come back here and I refresh the gateway, I can see I've got all of this additional stuff now available on this API gateway. And yeah, so that's going from a source gateway to a target gateway in a touch over 5 seconds. Now, in the real world, what you might want to do is use the Node.js tooling, because there might be some things that you want to change between environments. We're also looking at additional tooling to allow you to apply deltas between environments. So you can think of that as like a per environment configuration. So you can track between a dev environment, pre-prod, prod, and so on in the future. So those are all things that we're going to be bringing to light in terms of documentation and guidance and so on in the future as well. So this demo works really, really well with the Gateway Helm chart and with the Gateway Helm chart, but only if you're using a database-backed API gateway. So with that we have one endpoint to hit, and updating one gateway is going to do a cascade update to all gateways because they're all connected to the same database. If we take that external MySQL database away, then we're going to have to have a different way to update gateways. So the previous way that we've recommended running the ephemeral gateway has been to bootstrap all of the configuration, all of the policies, services, config that you need to those gateways, start them, and if something changes, then that's going to require a gateway restart. A gateway restart, so an update of the gateway deployment. Now, if you're just changing something like a cluster-wide property, that's not really a desirable approach. You could have a couple of minutes where your gateways are updating in the background. It's not something that you want to do on a frequent basis for changing very simple things. So the solution to that is the Layer7 operator, and that's going to be with an integration to Graphman and with an integration to the source of truth. So for that, I'm just going to quickly do a quick recap on what operators are, and then we'll go into the Layer7 operator and the custom resources that we manage, including the new one, which is a repository custom resource. I'll also show you those. We'll go through a demo of deploying the Layer7 operator. So very simply put, operators are software extensions to Kubernetes. They make use of custom resources. In the context of today, that'll be a gateway custom resource and a repository custom resource. And so in a nutshell, Kubernetes is really, really good at managing applications at broad scale. So as a container orchestration platform, it's great. What it doesn't have is application-specific knowledge about how your application should run. It doesn't have the human expertise of how an application should be configured, what should happen during this event, that event, and so on. So with the controllers concept, you can create custom resource or custom controllers that allow you to extend the functionality of Kubernetes to add specific things to manage your applications in Kubernetes without actually changing Kubernetes. So you're not changing the core code of Kubernetes, you're just adding to Kubernetes, and that makes updating Kubernetes and updating your operators much more seamless. and it also gives you the extensibility that you might need, or in our case, that we need to manage gateways without an external SQL database, and also in the future other things and so on as well. So the control loop, very simply put, is the way that most things work in Kubernetes. So we start with observation. So what we're doing here is observing desired state and reality. So if I have a gateway custom resource and I send it into the Kubernetes API, Kubernetes is going to, so my controller is going to observe that. It's going to go to my controller. It's going to analyze it. Hey, does this desired state, which is this gateway object, does that match reality? And if it doesn't, then it's going to act by getting the desired state to reality. And it's going to iteratively go over this control loop as long as the controller is running. So very high level overview of what operators are and what they allow us to do. So for the Layer 7 operator, the Layer 7 operator was built using the operator SDK. So that's probably the most popular framework for building operators in Kubernetes. As mentioned, we've got two custom resources. So we've got the repository custom resource, and the gateway custom resource. The process that we'll follow today is actually going to be to deploy the Layer 7 operator. So we'll do that live and hopefully not run into any problems. We're then going to go through so I'll be operations and I'll be developer today. We'll go through creating and updating a repository YAML. So I'll show you what that looks like and how that's configured. And we'll also go through creating a gateway, which is going to have reference to this repository. So the Layer 7 operator is going to observe, hey, I've got a new gateway YAML. Hey, I've got a new repository YAML. It's going to analyze. Hey, obviously in this context, desired state doesn't match reality, so it's going to act. It's going to act by cloning this Grafman repository, and it's going to act by instantiating a gateway deployment. And then when this gateway deployment is ready, it's going to apply the latest commit from this Grafman repository directly to this gateway. And I'll go through the configuration that we have for that as well. So I just wanted to cover a couple, I guess it's kind of a summary of what I've just sort of said, along with some additional information about the operator. So I've already covered that we have two custom resources that we manage. So there's gateway and repository. So this is currently a private repo. There is a version of the Layer 7 Kubernetes operator that's currently on the community site. That doesn't include the repository custom resource. It does include sorry about that. So it does include the gateway custom resource though. So you'd be able to take a look at that if you wanted to. This repository is going to be moved to CA APIM in the future. So that will be the home of the Layer 7 operator as we progress through the various developmental stages. So experimental and so on. I just wanted to mention a couple of the install modes. So we do support own namespace and basically single, multi, and all namespaces. What that means comes down to the role that you require to install the operator. So the install mode that we'll be using today is own namespace. So we'll be installing it with a namespaced role, which means that the Layer 7 operator won't have any control outside of the namespace that it's deployed in. And that's the way that we generally recommend that you install the Layer 7 operator. And that means that you can have different teams in different namespaces running their own version of the Layer 7 operator. They aren't interdependent, and so updates and so on don't need to be coordinated. You can also deploy one operator and have that manage all namespaces as well, dependent on your use cases. But I just thought I'd mention that. We'll be using own namespace today to do this. And if there aren't any questions, I'm going to go into a quick demo of the Layer 7 operator, and I'll describe the components that I just talked about. Okay, so the first thing I'll do quickly is introduce the actual repository that we'll be using today. So this is currently a private repository. and it's just called Graphman Infra. So this is a repository. So this repository contains multiple folders that have so gateway content on them. So there's CAC My Framework, and there's also Gateway. We'll be changing something in this folder today, but in our configuration, you'll see that we're using multiple folders. So we're going to be applying this folder. We're also going to be applying this folder to our target gateway. So for the actual breakdown of what's in this, so for the actual breakdown of what's in this repository, so we've got a file folder structure very similar to what we saw during the slide deck. What we'll be changing is just a very simple cluster-wide property. We're not going to do that now, but we're going to change a cluster-wide property called custom. So you can see there, it's very easy to read, and we'll change that to something like Thursday, and then we'll call that back, and we'll make sure that it gets updated. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually go ahead and deploy the operator. So if I do kubectl get pods, what we'll see is one gateway. So that's the gateway that we interacted with earlier. So I'm just going to leave that running there, and I'm going to apply the operator bundle. So this operator bundle contains everything that the Layer7 operator needs to run in Kubernetes. It includes all of the custom resource definitions. It includes the operator deployment itself, and all of the RBAC and so on that goes with that too. So all I've got to do is run that apply. And that's gone and created a bunch of additional things for us in Kubernetes. So the next thing I'll do is just tail the log of that. So you can see it's been created, and if I do so I can see that the operators come up. I can see the repository and gateway controllers both running. So those are separate controllers that each manage. So one manages gateway, one manages repository. So the next thing that I want to do is go ahead and create a repository. So to do that, I'm just going to run kubectl apply security v1 repository.yaml. What's actually in this file is very simple. So it's an API. It's a kind repository. I've just given it very simply a name. It's got an endpoint, which is that repository that we just took a look at. I'm specifying a branch. So if you had different branches, then you could specify different branches you might want to clone if you just want to check out a different branch, or you have a dev gateway or something like that. This is an experimental item, which is just a sync interval. How often do you want to sync this? And then there's authentication. So you've got the vendor there. Any Git provider should work fine with this. And you've got a username and you've got a token to use to access that. So if we go ahead and apply that, that's going to create that resource in Kubernetes, and we should see that coming through on the log down here. So I'll just bring that up a bit.
Gary, just mentioned, I think that's a private repo you've published there, isn't it? The Layer7 operator, because it's not available to any of us.
Yes, yeah. So let me quickly touch on that. So that work, yeah. So the current,
I just know that other people are trying. That's all.
Yeah. So this one is public. So this is a previous version of the Layer7 operator. So it's not that much older. It's just that the new repository stuff hasn't been released yet. But in the future, the Layer7 operator will live on CA APIM, not the not the other link that was shared in the in that folder. So it'll live here. I don't think I'm signed in. Yes, I'm not signed in with that user, but it'll live here in the future in that CA APIM repository.
Cool. Thanks.
No problem. Okay, so we created the Grafman Infra repository, and the Layer 7 operator has taken that up. It's created a secret with the author. Obviously, you could look to use an existing secret name so that you wouldn't have credentials in the open. But that's fine for this. And we have, and that's also been reconciled. So it's taken the latest commit from that repository, which is, so it starts in 4ED, which matches 4ED over here. So it's taken the latest commit. It's stored that locally. And what the operator is going to be doing, or what the repository controller is going to be doing, is every 30 seconds, it's going to be going to the Git repository, and it's going to be saying, "Hey, what's your latest commit?" And if the commit changes, then it's going to update the commit here. So the other thing that we can do with that is take a look at the status of the repository. So this is a Kubernetes object that you can query. So we'll do kubectl get repository Grafman infra, and we'll output that to YAML. So I can see here for status, the commit is the same as what I have here in my log, and I've also got the last time that this was updated. So now that we have a repository synced, and we've got the Layer 7 operator watching that, the next thing to do is going to be to actually deploy a gateway, because we want to have this repository applied to a gateway. We want this to be the source of truth for a gateway. So this is the custom resource for gateway. We're giving it a simple name of SSG. We're giving it version 11, so it's going to be the base. The base version of the container gateway at gateway 11. When not enabling auto scaling, we're going to have 2 replicas though, and we're not doing anything else, so that different to things that we've done in previous sessions. So all of this configuration, if you're looking between the Layer 7 operator and the gateway Helm chart, the majority of the configuration is going to be much the same. So if you're moving between the two, a lot of this is going to look really familiar. We'll also be having updating documentation to represent minimal ways to do this as well, with, I guess, recommended options and so on. So there is quite a lot in this file, but that could change in the future as well. So we've also, in the gateway, to reference the repository, we have very simply a repository reference. The repository reference is Grafman infra, and that matches the name that we created here. So when this gateway is created, it's going to go to this. So when the gateway is created, the gateway controller is going to take a look at this repository. So first off, check if it exists, and if it does, then it's going to try and sync this to gateways. As I mentioned, there's a couple of directories that we'll be looking at. So there's CAC My Framework, which is a folder that contains essentially a Grafman bundle, and Gateway, which contains a Grafman bundle, both in expanded format. And the type here is dynamic. So there's going to be a difference between a static repository and a dynamic repository. Basically, if this changes, the gateway will be updated. The gateway will be updated directly. If the type is static, then that's going to require a restart of gateways for those changes to be applied. These are also things that we're currently sort of working on fleshing out as well. So it's all kind of part of that experimental phase or trial phase. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and create that gateway resource. And there's some copy paste stuff that I've not cleaned up there, but that's fine. So kubectl apply -f. So I'm passing in I'm just going to pass in the right one there. So that's going to be gateway.yaml. And we should see a bunch of stuff being created. We might see a couple of errors as is the nature with experimental things. Okay, no errors, which is great. So you can see there's a secret that's created, there's some config maps, some more secrets, there's a service that's been created, and we're also checking the status of the deployment. So because that deployment's not ready yet, we're not going to be applying any of the dynamic Grafana configuration from our repository. So the idea is that we'll wait until the deployment's ready, and then we'll start administering policy to it. So if I do kubectl get pods, then I should see I've got two additional gateways that have been deployed, and both of those are ephemeral gateways. So there's no database configuration that's been added to this. As soon as the deployment is ready, what's going to happen is the gateway controller is going to sync. The gateway controller is going to sync each pod individually with the folders that are that we specified in our repository reference here. So it'll do one for CACMI framework, and it'll do one for gateway. So we should see 4 updates coming through here. Yeah, so from a logging perspective, this is also very much development cycle stage. So this will also change and become more informative and so on in the future, just in case there was a question about that. So our deployment's ready now. And the operator now has, so the operator's now detected that everything's ready. Okay, so there was an error there, which is fine. And we're now applying the latest commit. So you can see here, if I expand this a little bit, that we have some information about the repository. So there should be the directory there. So the directory is gateway that's been applied, CIC my framework, directory, and there should be one more for CIC, so CIC my framework. So there's going to be 2 applies per gateway. So basically we're applying multiple folders. It could be multiple repositories to the same gateway, and we're doing that as they change. Now, obviously, you could just use one folder. You could also just target the base of the the base of the repository. But we wanted this to be as extensible as possible. So if you want to have multiple folders, if you want to organize it that way, that's fine. If you want it to have multiple repositories, you can organize it that way. That's fine too. Completely extensible as you need. So now that that's up and running, the next thing that we probably want to do is a quick test. As a quick test. So this is going to go to operatormanagedgateway.briosimlabs.com. This is going through just a very simple English controller, and I've got v1 CICD, and that's going to come back with a message of Tuesday, which matches what's currently on this repository here. So what we actually want to do is have this Tuesday message change. So what I can do is edit this file. I'm just going to edit it directly. I'll change Tuesday to Thursday because it's Thursday. And I'm just going to call this a critical update as critical update as my description. I'll commit that directly to the main branch, which is what we're targeting. And the latest commit is now 8B 6B, or it starts in that anyway. So the next time that the reconcile loop runs for this repository, it's going to pick up, hey, the latest commit doesn't match what I currently have available here. So that's going to result in the repository controller going and downloading the latest commit from GitHub, and that's also going to trigger gateways to update as well. So from a gateway perspective, we're also tracking on a per pod basis, because this is ephemeral, the latest commit that is applied to a particular gateway. So you can see that the repository has been reconciled, and that's also instantiated, or that's also kicked off a synchronization for the latest commit to each of the gateway nodes that are here. So the next thing I can do is, so get pods, and if I do get pod and I paste in one of the gateway IDs, this should be the latest one. I can scroll up to, so we're currently tracking this through some of the labels. So I can see I've got Grafman Infra as as the repository, and there's the 8B, 6B. That's assigned to this gateway. So if I had additional repositories, then I would have a label for each of the repositories that are running on this pod. But that's pretty much so real-time representation of what's available on this particular pod. So now if I do a curl to the endpoint, I get back a message of Thursday. So that's been updated automatically by the Layer 7 operator. So with that, so are there any questions on that process? I know whenever you go through a sort of CI/CD journey, because everything happens in the background, it looks So are there any questions on anything that I've done, or any configuration options, or?
Just for the sake of being sure, the the directories that you specify in your YAML hand charts here, are they done sequentially? So there is a guarantee of order. That means the first one's going to be Cache My Framework, the other one Gateway. I'm thinking about this because I'm already thinking about decomposing, in fact, all the bundles I want to inject into the gateway, so that the common framework is done first, and then after that, for example, project by project or some stuff like this.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that came up when we were sort of looking at this concept to begin with. So currently, there's no explicit ordering that we have in code, but that is definitely something that we're going to be looking to add. So so being able to order repositories. So there's kind of two levels, right? So there's being able to order the repository itself that you're referencing. So when does that get applied? And then further down, there's being able to order the actual directory itself that you're looking at. I think for a lot of customers, going with like the sort of base directory is probably going to be fine. But yeah, it's a very good point, and definitely something that we'll look to add in as well.
Thanks.
Are there any more questions?
Is that has been already tested on OpenShift? We are using OpenShift for 4.10. Is it compatible, in fact, with this?
So this so I tested this version of the operator on 4.10. So Layer 7 community, Layer 7 operator. So this was tested on OpenShift 4.10. I think I include that somewhere here in the.
I saw it.
Yeah. So because it's experimental, it's technically not official. But yeah. So OpenShift as something that we test for is definitely something that's very high up in priority list in terms of new platforms and certifications and so on. So yeah. The idea would be that this is supported on OpenShift. We're also looking at a stretch goal, this PI, of having the operator deployed to the operator hub, which is something I'd really like to do. So but it's going to be dependent on time and so on, and I guess availability of it as well. But that would be the goal for the sort of stretch goal for this PI, and if not, we can look to push that out later on. But definitely OpenShift would be a big target for us as a platform to run this.
As we are speaking about external repositories such as Operator Hub and so on, we also are using Quay, Red Hat Quay, in fact, as our main repository stuff. So is this something also you're considering?
So Quay as an image repository.
Okay, I thought it was also for the other stuff. Okay, my bad.
No. I'm yeah. Sorry, I'm asking. I haven't used Quay myself, but I mean, yeah. So from an operator perspective with repositories, the library that we use to integrate with Git is just a Git library. So Git as a standard protocol or a standard pattern. So it should work with GitLab, Bitbucket, and so on. So that shouldn't be a problem from an image perspective, because I have seen images from Quay.io, so or at least I think I have. So maybe it does more than one thing, which is very likely. So that, but yeah, so for the images themselves, that should be absolutely fine too. It would just be a case of updating the image tags and so on, which should be absolutely fine. I think that would be something that we look at getting right before we publish to the operator hub, and it would also be one of the investigations that we would have to do before going there as well, which is another reason it's kind of a stretch goal, because we haven't investigated that as much. It would just be at this point something that I really want, but also a nice to have, and something that customers have asked for in the past.
And I would have another question, is that is it doable, in fact, to have a standard gateway on which you're working to deploy and work on a framework APIs, and then use Graphman and maybe the Node.js part in order to get a folder structure, and this one, in fact, you inject it directly into GitHub? Is this the overall idea?
So in terms of, so standing up a development gateway, developing some stuff in Policy Manager, exporting it into a folder, and then pushing it into GitHub.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think the Node.js client would be responsible for taking the stuff from that target gateway, taking the stuff from that dev gateway or that source gateway and putting it into, so first a JSON file and then expanding it into something that you can push into a repository. But yeah, so once you have the repository structure, which you can create with a Node.js client, then you would just use standard Git tools to push that into the Git repository of your choice.
Okay, thanks.
No problem.
Can we integrate these gateways with the portal?
A question about portal.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So in terms of integration with Portal, the kind of first revision of this doesn't have that, but because there would need to be changes in kind of both places to get that integration working. So there are things that we're currently evaluating in terms of the best way for, and really what we're talking about is kind of integration of ephemeral gateway with Portal. So if you're looking at a database back gateway running as a container, then integration with Portal, you can sign in through Policy Manager, or you can do the headless enrollment of a gateway with Portal, and that's absolutely fine. What we're looking at and evaluating is ways to ways that make sense for the ephemeral gateway to integrate with Portal. It's very likely going to be something like a PAPI endpoint that an ephemeral gateway can call to get the latest policy it needs, and so on. And in that context, you would have the portal as a source of truth. But you may also have a Git repository as something that you keep for infrastructure. We haven't clearly defined that yet. So yeah, I mean, also if you have suggestions and sort of input that you'd like to add to that, then feel free to sort of send that over, and that's always something that we can discuss too.
Yeah, you've got an email from me waiting upon some answers about that as well, Gary. So when you get round to checking your email, you can find one of mine asking the same question almost.
Yeah. I did read your email earlier, Vince. Sorry, I haven't replied yet.
That's all right. No, don't expect it yet.
Yeah, it is a very it is a fairly common question, especially as we start talking about. Also, obviously, there's the MySQL reliance, which isn't a problem for some customers. It's a problem. It is a problem for other customers, but at the end of the day, it becomes a bottleneck that has to be managed. So removing the database is definitely something that we want to have as an option. And then obviously that also has to work with the portal and any other tools that we provide. So that's definitely something that we're looking into. But in terms of everything else that's going on, it's it has to be a coordinated effort between the two. So it's a little bit further down the road. So a question to everyone on the call in terms of the update mechanism, which is basically a pull mechanism from the operator to Git. Can you think of any objections to that process? And would you rather have a different source of truth? So not necessarily relating to secrets management and stuff like that. We'll be looking at different ways to do that in the future as well. But in terms of the operator syncing with the Git repository and then applying to sort of gateways from there, are there any concerns about that approach, or any sort of feedback or thoughts?
Maybe it would be great if we could push, in fact, directly from GitHub instead of having the operator pulling.
Yeah, so with the database back gateway, you absolutely can push from GitHub. So using GitHub Actions, right, to a gateway, provided you've got a public endpoint or an endpoint available from GitHub. So it might be an IP restriction or some IP restriction. So you absolutely can do that. The problem with ephemeral, though, is that in Kubernetes you have a single service that may be fronting, maybe it's 100 gateways. If we think about scaling an ephemeral gateway, it could be 10 gateways, could be one gateway, but you need to update every single one of them to get that configuration over to them. So that's kind of the problem that we run into with that, which is why the operator does the syncing and the application, because it runs inside Kubernetes, so it has access to get all of those endpoints and then to apply the changes.
Yeah, if you use Git runners or anything like that, then you're that's a little bit blind to what is actually in your Kubernetes environment currently.
Yeah, well, I guess so. When we do start looking at integrations with Portal, then we'd be looking at introducing a webhook, as kind of a notification to say, this gateway was updated, so that could go to a notification channel when a gateway is updated with some details about what happened during the process, so that you're not necessarily kept in the dark. In terms of approval workflows, we haven't implemented anything yet, mainly because a lot of those approval workflows are going to exist on source control anyway, and so trying to sort of implement a one size fits all, would have been potentially clunky, at least this early on. So that's the reason I ask. It's going to be something that we'll have to continue to evaluate. Do we want to add more functionality around that? Do we want to look at more efficient ways to do the process? We thought that this was the most efficient way to sort of get policy, so that we're not hitting GitHub with 100 requests, one per gateway. We're doing it once and then applying it from within our own infrastructure. But yeah, I think these things will evolve over time as they naturally do.
I think you get more feedback once people have had a bit of a play. Maybe a workshop or something would be a good idea for customers, to actually play with this and have a go themselves, because then they think about their own use cases.
Yeah, absolutely. That so much like we've done with Grafman, and kind of specialized sessions and so on, that we'll look to do the same with the operator.
Yeah, hey, really quick. We kind of use OpenShift a lot here at Norfolk Southern, and I mean, I know OpenShift has the operator lifecycle. So if some stuff is like really low on the life cycle, some stuff's really high. I think as high as it goes, you can have like basically automatic deployments and auto updates and all that stuff. So I think if you follow or pick where you guys feel comfortable on that path, I think that could help out a lot. Personally, I would like automatic deployments, but at the same time, if you have them, you can kind of turn it off as well. So.
So in terms of Olm, so the operator lifecycle manager, when I was deploying to OpenShift, I think the features that I added were kind of the first two, I guess, because there's like green text, right?
Yeah.
That might be related to the operator itself and not necessarily the application. So I'm not as familiar with the operator lifecycle manager as you might be.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I guess it kind of controls the operator. So, or it tells you like what level of support the operator will give you. Like some are just like manual, but some you can see updates and like auto update, like all the Red Hat ones are. I don't remember all the levels, but without looking it up, but
yeah. I think I think I tried to add more, and I think I got the syntax wrong for it. But at least the first and second level, I think I had
okay.
kind of checked. It's all configuration based, right? And there's
Yeah.
certifications that you can go through from an operator hub perspective. So we'd probably look at getting into the community operator hub to start with, and then if that if that goes well, then we might look at getting into kind of certification space and so on. But that's not really a decision that I can make. It's something that our product team would have to make and obviously discuss with compliance and so on.
One other quick one. Whereabouts does testing and rollback get involved here? Because you're doing changes on your Git repository and it's just getting applied. Now, there's got to be some sort of staging and testing and then applying to next stages. Are we just looking at one section of that and then in between you start doing your testing?
So that's a good point. In terms of the testing, there are a couple of options that I've sort of been thinking about around. So I think firstly you would have as part of this process, after you do a commit, you would have maybe a webhook that comes through and says, "Hey, I've been updated. I've been up." Also, the operator says, "I've updated this gateway deployment and these pods to the latest, to the latest and greatest," and that might kick off a test that does some functional testing against the latest. At this point, you will have gone through the different cycles. So you would have gone through, test environment, dev environment, QA, pre-prod, prod, and so on. So
so this is just one siloed vertical that you're working on here, and then you move to the next vertical as soon as next environment, as soon as you've actually tested this one through another source, through some sort of webhook.
Yeah. In terms of rollback though, it would be governed by the repository. So, for example, if you decided to undo this commit on this repository, that would result in a different commit ID, being present. So the operator would pick up the latest commit, which is the previous commit, and it would apply that back to the gateways. So one of the potential boiling points might be is if you have a really big commit that comes in, and so you're adding 10, 15 new services and so on. Then you roll it back. Those 10, 15 new services that you created will still exist even on the ephemeral file system because you haven't restarted the gateway. So there's a couple of options that we're sort of thinking about for that, and it might be looking at looking at source and target. So source and target diffs and saying, okay, if the diff is this big, by whatever metric we decide, or whatever metric you decide, then it results in like a rolling restart of the gateway deployment. In which case, you kind of set back to whatever you've defined in the gateway resource. So only the repositories that you've defined at their latest commit, which may be something that was rolled back. But it's definitely something that we're sort of thinking about. It doesn't play the same way for a database back gateway. But that's also something that exists with RESTman. If you do a sort of massive push forward, you're doing writes to the database. When you do try and roll back, you're going to have to that process isn't as seamless. With Grafman, then what you can do is you can look at a summary between the two commits. And what you could do is you could craft a very specific set of JSON or a very specific Grafman bundle that you could apply back, and that should technically clean up the other stuff. So that would be something that we would, yeah. So those types of things are all things that we'll look to have more examples and so on of in the future, and also best practices as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So I think I wasn't watching the time, so we're so a few minutes over. I'm happy to stay on if there's additional questions. Otherwise, I can stop the recording, and thank everyone for participating.
Thanks a lot again.
Thanks everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Gary, for the last 6 months of excellent dive into containers and Layer 7.
No problem. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah. Thank you for Gary's hour.
Maybe we'll rename it next time.
Yeah, Gary's hour.